Well, you've heard of speed dating, so I call this speed revolution. So the first question, is civilization a war against the living world? And next, is that war real or is it a metaphor? Because there's a whole bunch of people who would say, not only is that a metaphor, it's a really bad metaphor. There's no enemy. There's no us and them. There's just well-meaning, if wounded, people. That actually cuts to the main division between the radical and liberal perspectives, as Cameron has already addressed. But power is not a mistake, out of which the powerful can be educated. It's not a misunderstanding, and it's not a disagreement. And what that means is that justice cannot be won by rational argument, by moral exhortation, by personal transformation, or by some kind of spiritual epiphany. It's won by taking power away from the powerful and then dismantling their institutions. Thank you. So we've already had the categories of response that Cameron's gone over. I just want to reiterate that none of these are liberal or radical on their own. They can all overlap in ways that are really crucial to resistance movements, but they can all be diversions that just dead end. And I want to talk about withdrawal for a moment, because I see withdrawal right now as this place where the environmentally conscious have crawled to die. The main difference between withdrawal as a successful strategy and withdrawal as a failed strategy is whether that withdrawal is seen as intimately linked to a political struggle, or whether it's seen as adequate in itself. And that cuts, again, right to that division between radical and liberal. The issues of identification, of loyalty, those are really crucial to building the political consciousness that's necessary for a resistance movement. But that alone is not enough. The withdrawal has got to go beyond the intellectual, the emotional, the psychological, to include a goal of actually winning justice. Withdrawal may give solace, but ultimately it will change nothing. And living in a rarefied bubble world of the converted will not get us there, and it will certainly not save our planet. So we're going to take all of this and give you an example, just sort of a real-life example to walk you through. And I've picked the Irish struggle for independence. So the Irish had endured English occupation for over 800 years, the usual array of horrors. Now in 1880, there's a movement that starts called the Gaelic Revival. Now this movement sought to bring self-respect and cultural pride to the Irish as Irish. So they start teaching the language which was going extinct. Music, dance, theater, all of these are really ancient traditions in Ireland. So they had a lot to build on. And then you have people like Maud Gonne. And if you don't know who she was called the Irish Joan of Arc, and you should go home and look her up. And her son, Sean McBride. Everything you need to know about a resistance movement is embodied in her life. So this was the newspaper that she put out. And then you have the Gaelic Athletic Association. So what? They're running around playing games. Actually, no. They revived traditional Irish sports. That's how they began. But this proved to be a training ground for the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which is what becomes the IRA. So they're not just running around playing games. They're learning how to work as a team. They're learning how to strategize, and they're learning how to be physically strong. So all of this comes together, the Gaelic Revival, in what's called the Land War. Now, this is a struggle that gets started to win back land ownership. There's tremendous poverty, starvation, hunger, famine, all across Ireland. They'd lost control of the land. And this is a struggle to win back the land. It's extremely successful. By the year 1914, 90% of the land was once again held by small and medium-sized farmers. So they did it. And it was won almost entirely using nonviolent techniques, mostly these rent strikes and boycott. In fact, the word boycott comes from Captain Boycott, and it comes from this struggle. So every time you say that, you're actually referring back to the Irish struggle. But I love the language in this old stuff, the 19th century. Redeem your character now. Don't you have like a list of people you want to say that to? Redeem your character now, sir. We don't talk about character anymore, and we really need to bring this back. Anyway, from there, from the land war, they have this great success. This is what launches the struggle for actual independence. Now, it all starts with that Gaelic revival, okay, with the culture of resistance. Nobody said, well, let's just put on some nice plays, and we'll sing our own songs, and the English will go away. Nobody said, let's just change our consciousness, okay? If we can think nice thoughts and love each other, that'll do the trick. We need to just be the change that we wish to see. We don't need to challenge a corrupt and brutal system of power. No, we've got this magic trick called consciousness. That's not what happened. The Irish culture of resistance believed in resistance, it encouraged it planned for it supported it, and it prepared for its success. So they did everything from support for political prisoners, to feeding starving children, to support for families that were having trouble. They set up their own court system to settle disputes, and they ultimately demanded loyalty to Ireland and the Irish cause. Eventually, this leads to both violent and nonviolent confrontation with the English power system. And, it was basically successful. But they used all three categories. So they used the legal, they used direct action, and they used that withdrawal. But they understood how they all work together. Part of withdrawal that's necessary is breaking through that psychology of the oppressed. Now, people survive oppressive conditions using three basic psychological mechanisms. So that would be denial, accommodation, and ultimately consent. So if they had but known they were slaves, right? Breaking through that psychology is crucial. It may, in fact, be the hardest job that we have as radicals. We could follow the same trajectory from, for instance, the Harlem Renaissance through the Civil Rights Movement. Any number of struggles follows the same pattern. Developing self-respect, basic political consciousness, loyalty to your own, that's crucial, all right? But it's not enough. So it's necessary but not sufficient. So why is so much of the left insisting on personal solutions, withdrawal as the main political strategy, with this vague millennialism as a fallback? Well, we need a little more history here. My ex always says that history is same characters, different costumes, and we are about to find out exactly how right she is. So, there's a lot of history in this one. We don't have time. Trust me on this, though. This goes back a good 3,000 years in the West, really to ancient Greece. But we're going to pick this up with the Romantic movement. Now, this is an artistic movement that gets going in the late 18th century in Western Europe. It's at least in part a reaction against the Age of Enlightenment. So this ascendancy of science and rationality. The cosmos at one point was, the main image of the cosmos was as a living body. And all of a sudden, it's replaced by clockwork. The cosmos is now a machine. It's no longer alive. And the Industrial Revolution kicks into gear. So this is what's happening across Europe. And what it means on the ground is that the rivers, the forests, the wetlands are falling to the Industrial Revolution. People are being pushed off their land into urban squalor. This is the same story everywhere, okay? It never has a happy ending. So this is a hard time in Europe. The Romantic movement gets going, partly a reaction to this. And there's three themes of the Romantic movement. You have the evocation of the past, you've got the isolation of the individual, and then this reconnection with nature. Germany in particular produces a lot of Romanticism's art and the music and whatnot, reasons we can't get into, but that's sort of the epicenter of all of this. And out of that comes this group of people called the Lebensreform movement. Now, this is a social movement that emphasizes physical fitness and natural health. Any of this sound a wee bit familiar, right? These are all variations on that theme of reconnecting to nature. Now, everybody from Isadora Duncan to Leon Trotsky to Franz Kafka passes through this world at some point. Gandhi was actually a fan of the Lebensreform. He sets up a nature cure clinic in India. So it goes east, and what comes west, of course, is Buddhism, Hinduism, meditation, yoga. So there's this sort of cross-fertilization amongst these people. The Lebensreform, they set up their own clinics, their own schools, alternative communities. This is the big one. This is Ascona in Switzerland. This is like the big Sur of the age. Now, some of the Lebensreform, they're school teachers in Berlin, high school teachers. And the whole idea is to get at nature, so they start taking their students out on hikes. And the hikes extend into weekends, and eventually this actually coalesces into a lifestyle. These middle-class teenagers drop out of these middle-class lives, and they form their own subculture. And now we come to the Wandervogel. Now I'm real curious. How many of you have ever heard of the Wandervogel? That's more than I've ever seen. Well, you know the drill. Ignorant of history, condemned to repeat it. 90% of what's wrong on the left really goes back to these people. So they start to coalesce into their own group. This is what they value: the rural, the emotional, spontaneity. They sing folk songs. They dress in this pseudo-peasant garb. They play with fasting, vegetarianism, raw foods, and they embrace all these ecological ideas. Now, this is all before the year 1900, okay? It's also the, it's the infrastructure for the youth hostel movement, because they start taking over abandoned buildings across the German countryside. Anybody can stay there for free. And this literally becomes the youth hostel movement. So they're the anarchist vegan squatters of the age. The connection between the Lebensreform and the Wandervogel youth to the 1960s counterculture in this country are startlingly direct. So for instance, here's the painters. There are two painters that set the artistic style of the age. This is all 1900. This is not 1965. What I have, the red arrow up there, that's a peace sign. So they're already using the peace sign. It's transplanted whole. World War I comes. A lot of them are draft resistors, so they leave Germany. Well, where do they go? You're not going to do this in Minnesota. They go to California. And this is a book all about this immigration process. Other examples. All of these books get taken up by the hippies in Haight-Ashbury 50 years later. But trust me, this is an unbroken line of cultural continuity. So what we have is an alternative culture. What we need is an oppositional culture, a culture of resistance. I started making this chart to try to figure out, all right, what are the differences? And suddenly I get the light bulb experience. What I was looking at was a culture created by the adolescent brain. In the year 1911 in Germany, there were more 17-year-olds than there ever would be again. Okay? So it comes to the United States. It goes dormant about 50 years. Starts to pick up speed with the beatniks. What happens in 1960? It's another bumper crop of teenagers. And of course this is what they're attracted to. It's a culture created by people exactly like them. Now, I've been everywhere across this continuum, sometimes all at once. But the difference between an alternative culture and an oppositional culture, this is actually a split to the root that has been between the romantics and the resistance. Really, it's been there for centuries, the split. Now, they both start with some rejection of the established social order. But they identify their enemy differently, and from there they head in opposite directions. The first difference is really obvious. Are you apathetic to political engagement? Or do you consciously embrace resistance? That would be pretty key. The focus on the individual is a hallmark of liberalism. So, personal example becomes political strategy, and hence this emphasis on things like, your personal carbon footprint. Am I the only one who's noticed? When you talk about carbon footprint, that is the only time that men try to prove they're smaller. Just saying. So let's talk about example as a political strategy. Now, by their nature, agricultural societies are imperialist because they're based on drawdown. So they're always going out and conquering the neighboring regions, bringing the resources back in. Over and over for 10,000 years. That is the pattern that civilization follows. Now, some of the indigenous people in those surrounding areas, they embody the values that everyone in this room holds dear. Okay, they're peaceful, egalitarian, sustainable cultures. And in all that time, over all those invasions, the face-to-face example of an egalitarian, sustainable culture has never once changed the invaders. Okay? It has never once brought on an epiphany amongst the invaders. That's never once. The dominant culture will not change because it sees the beautiful nonviolent values that we embody, and it will not change because it beholds our beautiful free-range compost piles. Okay? Personal example does not work. We are going to have to give this one up because there is way too much at stake. Now, the farthest extreme of individualism is where personal lifestyle becomes personal purity. And identity itself is declared a political act. And this is where subcultures start to feel like cults. But any strategy that's based on individual change is doomed to fail because oppression, subordination, these are not individual conditions. They're group conditions. They're class conditions. And they take group effort to bring them down. So, the defining characteristic of an oppositional culture, on the other hand, is that it seriously claims to be that cradle of resistance. So where the alternative culture exists to create personal change, the oppositional culture exists to nurture a serious movement for political transformation. It understands that concrete systems of power have to be dismantled and that such a project will require tremendous commitment, risk, and even loss of life. But that focus on the individual is where liberalism and the adolescent brain dovetail perfectly. Now, the adolescent brain is still under construction. Basically, the areas of the brain that are responsible for things like impulse control, for long-range planning, for considering consequences, those aren't working when you're a teenager. Adolescents literally cannot understand cause and effect. And also, our sense of time is not fully developed until we're 21. So these are people who cannot do long-range planning. They're prone to risk-taking. They're prone to impulsive behavior, flashes of anger, that overall emotional intensity. You all remember what it felt like to be 13. And that phase of life is really when the question of identity, of who I am, becomes so important. And that's okay. That's your job when you're a teenager. There's nothing wrong with that. You have to figure that out. The problem is when you have a youth culture instead of the culture of resistance. So what happens? Well, the idea of authority is rejected out of hand, where a serious resistance movement would instead be training the appropriate people for leadership positions. The alternative culture sees the enemy as this constraining set of values, of convention, social convention, rather than systems of power. The main program of attacking boundaries has had serious consequences on the left and across pop culture as a whole. These were not just any teenagers. They were privileged and they were male. And this has had some pretty drastic consequences for women and girls. Alienation may be a good place to start, but you can't stop there. Alienated individuals, by definition, cannot do loyalty or solidarity. Okay, they're alienated. And you are going to have solidarity to build a serious movement, which means you have to play well with others. Okay, it's a group project. Now that adolescent concern of identity, of who I am, this takes on an importance that outweighs what one might actually do. So the counterculture is a product of this psychology, and that's where it's been permanently stuck. The concerns of adolescence, its gifts and its shortcomings, are the framework for the alternative culture that we now have. Those community norms and those behaviors have become accepted across the left in a process that Theodore Roszak calls a progressive adolescentization of dissenting thought and culture. So, this is the motto of the Wandervogel. No joke. Same characters, different costumes. We have Abby Hoffman, Revolution for the hell of it. Now, on the positive side, the gifts of youth would be that incredible moral vigor, right? It just cannot tolerate hypocrisy of any kind. The fearless courage, the passion, the idealism. You know, by the time you're 30, that's wear and thin. By the time you're 40, it's pretty well over. Every movement needs an invigoration of that, and just that constant infusion from the young. But the alternative culture stops that vigor from effective action. And when you can't fight power, all you can fight is each other. And this is what Florence Kennedy calls horizontal hostility. Here's a diagram. So in the first panel, the king has all the power, and the poor people cannot figure out how to fight back. So they're sad. In the second panel, they've figured out they can do resistance. They are fighting up the hierarchy. They've got their solidarity. They've even got some weapons. They're going to try. King's not so happy. Third panel, they want to fight, but they're not fighting up. They've decided that resistance is not possible or it's impractical. All they have left to fight is each other. And this is horizontal hostility. This can be a feeding frenzy of ugly gossip, character assassination. In more militant groups, it often takes the form of paranoid accusations. And in the groups that, you know, encourage macho posturing, it ends with men shooting each other. Not a pretty thing. But this is the problem. If all you can fight is each other, if all you're going to do is vertical fighting and you don't fight up, yes, then, you know, examining the minutiae of people's personal lives feels like a righteous activity. But honestly, if it seems like more like junior high school, well, there's a reason. So the final problem with the alternative culture, the Wandervogel created this image of the peasant. Okay, so these were people who supposedly were authentic, they were anti-rational, and they lived in a state of nature. Now, there were actual peasants in Germany. This bore no relation to their lives. They could have used some solidarity, but the Wandervogel project was not about solidarity. So they get transplanted to the United States. Well, there aren't actually peasants in the United States. So two groups of people get sort of, you know, pressed into service for the psychological needs of the privileged. And this generally is African Americans and Native Americans. And so you have crap like this. Native Americans especially get cast as emotional, you know, natural, authentic. I'm hoping I don't have to explain how offensive this picture is. So on the alternative side, you know, cultural appropriation is certainly the norm. If we had a true oppositional culture, I mean, obviously, a cultural reclamation, protection of sacred ceremonies would be a number one task, as well as building solidarity across those differences. Okay, so let me tell you how this works in a successful resistance movement. The people over 30 have laid a lot of the groundwork, usually for a generation or two. In the civil rights movement, you had the Harlem Renaissance and the Pullman Porters. That's the bridge between slavery and the civil rights movement. They take a culture of survival and they turn it into a culture of resistance. So they're building self-respect, cultural pride, political experience, and material resources. And all four of those are really important. So it's like they're piling up all this driftwood, and they're even sprinkling some lighter fluid around on it. And all of that is really necessary. And then somebody strikes the match, and it's always the young. So you get the 4 college students who are willing to sit down at the lunch counter and face the angry mob. The 4 students who kicked this off, actually, the 3 of them had known each other since childhood. They were college roommates. 2 of them had been trained at Highlander at the school there. So this doesn't just spontaneously arise. I mean, really, this had been 2 or 3 generations of planning. That's not in any way to detract from the courage of those 4 students who started. And it's really important to recognize that it's always the young who strike that match, okay? That's where you get the courage, each and every time. So here's the college students. Then you get even younger kids. So this was the Children's Crusade. And these pictures electrified the world. I mean, the fact that anybody would turn a fire hose on a 12-year-old is pretty appalling. And then even younger children. So here we've got little Ruby Bridges single-handedly desegregating the Louisiana public school system. If you don't know her story, she has a memoir, but yeah, a 6-year-old. And I got to say that it's we don't have any right to be standing on the sidelines while our planet is murdered, saying there's nothing we can do, there's nothing we can do, when a 6-year-old can produce this kind of courage, right? Okay, the British suffragettes follow a very similar pattern. You've got 3 generations of people who are engaged in suffrage, labor concerns, and abolition. So there's this whole sort of ferment of revolutionary activity going on. Emmeline Pankhurst, who's one of the leaders of the British suffrage movement, she had Uncle Tom's Cabin read to her as a bedtime story. And she wrote in her journal, "Young as I was, I could not have been older than 5 years. I knew perfectly well the meaning of the words slavery and emancipation." Now that's a culture of resistance. In turn, her daughters, Christabel and Sylvia, are raised in the struggle. They used to cry because they were too young to go to political meetings, which I think is very cute. And then one day, Sylvia says to her mom, "How long you women have been trying for the vote. For my part, I mean to get it." And so Emmeline writes in her journal, was there a difference between trying for the vote and getting the vote? And she realizes what she has to do. If she could bring together that fearless courage of the young and the experience of the old, she would create a movement that could do it. And she was right, and that was what she did. And hence she created the WSPU. They did massive, relentless civil disobedience. They were tortured in jail with force feeding. Parliament passed a law saying that they could be tortured. So just flat out, yes, we're going to torture you. And Christabel escalates the troops. So from that point, they do arson. They blew up mailboxes, golf courses, historic buildings, and train stations. And they did all of that wearing corsets, which meant that they couldn't breathe. So they're, running through, the dark fields, being chased by police, encumbered in 30 pounds of skirting, climbing walls and scaling fences and blowing up buildings. And that is how women won the vote, was through arson. Gandhi was actually a big fan of the suffragettes. He subscribed to 3 different London newspapers so that he could keep up with their actions. So, yeah, that was how they did it. They were brilliant strategists, and they were loved by their movement. Now, the left now has this terrible tendency to cannibalize their leaders. This was not always the case. This is Emmeline. And that has everything to do with those cultural norms created by the adolescent brain. There's this knee-jerk reaction to all authority, rather than valuing the people who can be our leaders. So resistance movements need a constant infusion of courage and idealism that are the gift of youth. They also don't, they don't get anywhere without that, but what they also need is the experience, the stability, and the long-range planning that adults bring. So this is the take-home point. Cultures of resistance are always multi-generational, because you need both sides of that. Breaking the natural bonds between the young and the old, it means that political experience never accumulates. What it also means is that the young right now are not being socialized into a culture of resistance. They're being socialized into this incredibly toxic culture created by corporate America, which wants us cruel, stupid, and ugly, and frankly, they're winning. That culture has everything to gain by destroying our capacity for community, let alone our capacity for resistance. What we need is organized political resistance. So the task of an activist is not to navigate around systems of oppression with as much personal integrity as possible. It's to dismantle those systems. Thank you. Consumers' choices, spiritual choices, lifestyle choices are not going to disrupt global arrangements of power, and that's the problem. To get to a real resistance, we need that culture of resistance. Instead, we have what I call the permaculture wing. So it's the voluntary simplicity people, all that lifestyle stuff. I call them the Oinbees. So instead of the NIMBYs, we have the Oinbees. That's only in my backyard. Taken as a whole, they dismiss political activism as either impractical or impossible. I know there are some exceptions, but by and large, that's where they fall. This makes no sense. And in fact, it's a very bad habit that the left is going to have to give up. We are the people who need to be shouting from every rooftop and every street corner. Resistance is not only possible, failure is impossible given what's at stake. So let's pretend for a minute that we are in Nazi-occupied France, or we are in U.S. occupied Vietnam, or we are in U.S. occupied North America. Would anybody really suggest that riding our bikes and buying organic shampoo would drive them out and win back our freedom? I don't think so. Now, I know that we have an emotional reluctance to naming perpetrators. It's always hard to name a perpetrator, right? They do have names and addresses. More important, the infrastructure of industrial civilization is incredibly vulnerable, a point to which I will return. So how would a resistance movement be organized? Well, throughout history, you've got the culture of resistance that builds the new institutions that will be prepared to take over as the old system comes down. And then you've got the frontline resistance that does the actual confrontations with power. Now, I want to be clear that when I say combatants, words like combatant, that does not have to mean violence. The distinction is not between violence and nonviolence. The distinction is between doing something and doing nothing. So it's between confronting power in some direct way and submitting to power. So we need lots and lots of people to do that standard work that the culture of resistance does. Local economies, participatory democracy, systems of justice, all of that, especially that loyalty and material support. And what am I trying to say? Okay, yeah, and the direct support for the frontline resistance. That is like the key moment where you decide whether you're really a culture of resistance. And the vast majority of people involved in any kind of resistance, even as a concept, I think we just need to accept that the vast majority of them aren't going to do shit. And that's okay. Because in regular armies, only 2% ever take up weapons. So the other 98% of the armed forces just do the support work. The same is true with the IRA. Only 2% ever took up weapons. The other 98%, they did the support. Most people don't really have the personality for it, or they can't take the risk for reasons that are totally legitimate. What you need always is that 2%. So all of this, the last 30 minutes, the last 30 years, this is for you who are the 2%, because I know you're here, and you are the people that I want to talk to. Because we need to take down industrial civilization. We need warriors who will put themselves between what is left of this planet and fossil fuel. Now, that could be done nonviolently. If we hit the numbers, we could shut this party down by midnight. I don't see the numbers. I would love to be wrong. I would, in fact, vastly prefer to wage this struggle nonviolently, but I don't see the numbers, and my longing will not bring them forth. And it's a little late in the day for millennialism. So, given a realistic assessment of what we actually have, the only viable strategy that I can see is direct attacks on infrastructure. In very plain terms, we need to stop them. Now, this is not a game for children, and this revolution is not for the hell of it. We need a serious underground organization that has the discipline, the training, the command structure, and the strategic savvy to coordinate decisive attacks on a continental scale, and we needed it yesterday. And it would be really great if the permaculture wing would get on board and provide that loyalty and material support. But at the very least, they've got to stop saying that this can't be done. It can. The only real question is, why aren't we doing it? And I hate that the answer may be that we are the people who benefit from this repulsive arrangement of power. So, not only can it be done, there are books that will tell you how. This is from the U.S. Field Manual on Guerrilla Warfare. This was actually paid for by your tax dollars, so you might as well read it. Just saying. Asymmetric warfare. If there was ever an asymmetric conflict, this is it. So these are the 6 principles. Basically, this is when one group has all the money and all the weapons and all the power, and the other group doesn't have crap. This is not a pitched battle. You are not trying to fight and hold ground. What you're especially after is cascading systems failure, okay? And that is the phrase for this movement, cascading systems failure. You accomplish your objectives as swiftly as you can, and then you disappear, okay? You're not trying to hold ground. And I want to add, I shouldn't have to, but let's add this. The point is not to make a statement. It's to have a decisive material impact. Okay? In other words, you bring it down. Now, the reason you can learn about asymmetric warfare in places like West Point and the U.S. Army and in training camps all over the world is because it works. The principles have been honed for decades as a strategy direct attacks on infrastructure is highly effective. So please stop saying that this doesn't work. Now, beyond the general principles, you can learn about target selection. And I got to say, this hits my happy spot. Criticality, how important is it? Vulnerability, how tough is it? Accessibility, can you get to it? Recuperability, what would it take to repair it? Suddenly, some things start to make some sense. For instance, why groups like the ELF have had no real decisive success? Well, it's the targets. All the targets that we've chosen have low criticality and high recuperability. That's very typical for resistance groups that lack training, okay? It's the targets. It's not the commitment, it's not the courage, it's the targets. They're chosen for their accessibility, okay? But those targets are not in any way critical, and they are very easy to repair. This is your basic Starbucks Windows strategy. I say this as someone who has smashed her share of windows. I have personally destroyed thousands of dollars of property. It's a lot of fun. It's ultimately pointless if this is what you're doing. Why? Low criticality, high recuperability. We've got to stop thinking like vandals and start thinking like field generals. All right, we've been carrying out operations that are emotionally appealing in the hopes that this would somehow coagulate into something bigger. This was the problem, for instance, with the non-strategy of the Weather Underground. And increasing your firepower does not increase the soundness of your strategy. So look, you're not going to walk away with this, with a serious grounding in the principles of, guerrilla warfare. But my point is, other people have already figured this out. And they're serious people who intend, in fact, to win. They have a grand strategy. They've got some goals. They get their strategy. And then after examining the resources that they have on hand, they move on to tactics. So I would say we have two goals: to disrupt and dismantle industrial civilization, to remove the ability of the rich to steal from the poor and the powerful to destroy the planet. And goal two, to defend and rebuild those autonomous communities and ultimately to assist in the recovery of the land. So these two goals are interdependent, and the movements involved are going to have to work in tandem in some way. And that's why I want the permaculture wing to get on board. I mean, they really need to be doing, part two. That's really their job. It's always the task of the cultures of resistance. And it's going to take a lot of different organizations, mostly above ground, mostly working nonviolently. Part one could be achieved using nonviolent tactics. But we don't have the numbers, and I think everyone in this room knows that. So it's going to take an underground network that has both the commitment and the training to pull this off. In case you can't find a way to hope, there is actually some hope. And I think that the above ground could take their hope from the French labor strike that happened last November. Totally above ground, the protesters used trucks, they used human chains and a few burning tires, and they blockaded the fuel depots and managed to close all 12 of France's oil refineries. The major oil terminal was offline for 3 weeks, and that stranded 30 oil tankers in the Mediterranean because there was nowhere for them to offload. The major oil terminal, when the government tried to open the emergency reserves, the protesters blockaded 20 more terminals. So they escalated, right, when the government tried to stop them. In a few weeks, the entire economy was slowing to a halt for lack of fuel. Now, the French strikers did what every military and every insurgency does. They interrupted key nodes of infrastructure on that way to cascading systems failure, right? They did it using nonviolence. Well, if we had the bodies, it could be done. The question is, do we? For the underground, your hope is mend. This is the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta. Now, the oil industry has earned literally hundreds of billions of dollars off of Nigeria's oil. The Niger Delta is the world's largest wetland, only now it could more reasonably be called a sludge land. The people are knee-deep in oil industry waste. They used to be self-sufficient. They are now starving and sick. All the fish are dead, okay? There's nothing left to eat. The original resistance was Mosop, and that was led by poet-activist Ken Saro-Wiwa. Theirs was a nonviolent struggle against Shell Dutch Royal, trying to get the oil industry out. In 1995, Saro-Wiwa and 8 other leaders of the movement were hanged by the military government, completely illegitimate. Despite international outcry, nobody was able to save them, so they were all hanged. And by all accounts, Ken Saro-Wiwa went last, which means they made him watch all 8 of his best friends get murdered first. So, the level of sadism you're always dealing with these people. MEND is the second generation. They do direct attacks against workers, bridges, office sites, terminals, oil rigs, pipelines, and support vessels. They have managed to disable 1/3 1/3 of Nigeria's oil. In one single attack, they destroyed 10% of the capacity, the production capacity. There was a series of attacks last December, just before Christmas. They shut down 80% of the oil in Nigeria, 80%. Their main tactic is the use of speedboats and surprise attacks against simultaneous targets toward that goal of cascading systems failure. These people are quite serious. Now, the French did it non-violently because they had the numbers. Mend uses property destruction because they don't. What they do have is university educations. They've clearly studied other militant movements. And they also have a broad base of support amongst the local people, which helps because people give them safety. They don't turn them over to the authorities. But their training in combat is so good that they have come up against the private militaries of the oil companies. Oh, did you know oil companies have their own militaries? Yeah. I don't know where people in North America think oil comes from. I'm sure you have this discussion all the time with people in your lives, but yeah. Uh-oh, what happened? We've lost. Cameron, can you make this go back? We need to go back. Yes, thank you. So oil doesn't just fall from the sky, and honestly, you can't plant it with your nasturtiums. It has to come from somewhere. It has to be ripped off the land, which means that people have to be ripped from their land, which means those people have to be ripped in half. And that is called a private military. So Mend has come up against the private militaries. They've also come up against Nigeria's elite fighting units, and they've won. So that's how good these people are. This is a true resistance. They're not just a bunch of armed thugs, and they number just a few hundred. So understand, a few hundred people, well-armed and coordinated, have destroyed 1/3 of Nigeria's oil capacity. They've actually said to the oil industry, leave our land while you can or die in it. Now, I can guarantee that everyone in this room has more resources than all of Mend had put together when they started. Resistance is not just theoretically possible, it's happening now. The only real question is, will we join them? What if we said, leave our land while you can or die in it? What if we meant it? Okay, the facts as they stand. Our planet is dying. Actually, she's being drawn and quartered. We're on the verge of complete biotic collapse. Did you know that there are parts of China now where there are no longer flowering plants? It's because all the pollinators are dead. No flowering plants. That is 500 million years of evolution gone. Complete biotic collapse. We are out of soil, we are out of species, and we are out of time. And the climate holocaust has already begun. And we have got to abandon this concept of lifestyle politics and start thinking like a serious resistance movement, because this is a war. Now, I know it feels like daily life. It's been going on for 10,000 years, right? The lights are on, the cupboards are full, but it's a war. And if anyone is left alive 100 years from now, they are going to wonder, what the fuck was wrong with us? That we didn't fight like hell when our planet was going down. Now, you love something, or you wouldn't be here today. Love is a verb. We've got to let that love call us to action.